Hi there, I'm David Harvey, and I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Texts podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries, here every 2 weeks talking about two different texts taken from the Bible. This is our second season, and it's about the miracles of Jesus. We're halfway through this season at the moment. We've talked about Matthew's Gospel and Mark's Gospel. We're going to take a small break for the rest of August and be back for the second half of this season at the beginning of September, where we'll talk about miracles in Luke's Gospel and also in John. But for today, this is episode 8, and it's called Help My Unbelief. So, John, for our second text this week, we are in Mark chapter 9. Fantastic miracle story once again. This one with a lot of interesting things going on and a lot of things we can discuss and have some fun chatting around. But you're going to read this text for us. So I'm going to invite everybody to sit comfortably because it's a slightly longer reading than we often do. So make sure your aircon in the car is set just right. And this is Mark chapter 9 and verse 14.
Yeah. And if you're currently running, listening to this will probably cover a good mile and a half for you. So here we go, right? Okay, here we go. So verse 14, chapter 9 says, "When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. 'What are you arguing with them about?' he asked. A man in the crowd answered, 'Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not.' 'O unbelieving generation,' Jesus replied, 'how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me.' So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, 'How long has he been like this?' 'From childhood,' he answered. 'It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us.' 'If you can,' said Jesus, 'everything is possible for him who believes.' Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, 'I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief.' When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the unclean spirit. 'You deaf and mute spirit,' he said, 'I command you, come out of him and never enter him again.' The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, 'He's dead.' But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, 'Why couldn't we drive it out?' He replied, 'This kind can come out only by prayer.'"
So there is a story.
It's a story.
It's quite a text, and there's so much in this, John. I almost want to break it up into sections. You've got what's actually going on in this story, the healing, and then this sort of fascinating interaction between the Father and Jesus. So yeah. I feel like we should try and approach this story in its different parts, because otherwise I feel like you and me could be like two kids with an unlimited budget in a candy store, just run around in circles at all the fun stuff that's in this text. So in a very typical way for you and me, it's probably worth just saying that the Jesus has just come from this quite miraculous situation, which we talk about as the transfiguration of Jesus, where at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus has has sort of gone up onto this mountain with James and Peter and John, and they've had this remarkable situation where Jesus has been transfigured. He's been changed somehow in front of them, and Elijah and Moses have appeared with Jesus. This like highly kind of messianic sort of scene, and you hear this voice from God about Jesus being the beloved Son, this echo of what happens in his baptism story. So Jesus is arriving into our story today off the back of this hugely empowering, kind of encouraging type moment. He's been with these two great figures of Israel in some sort of miraculous transfiguration scene. He's heard his Father's voice tell him and remind him once again, "You're my beloved Son." And he comes down to this crowd. Now just notice this at verse 14. So they came to the disciples. There's a great crowd around them with some scribes arguing with them. They always seem to be there doing that. When the crowd saw him, just to notice this, they were immediately overcome with awe, and they ran to greet him. It's a strange little comment there. Why are they overcome with awe at just seeing Jesus? And some scholars have wondered. We saw Jesus be transfigured, right? The language, it says, let me just read the language for you just there. It says in verse 3 of chapter 9, his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there's sort of this sense that we assume that that's all stopped and Jesus is back to normal. But some scholars just point out that it's really interesting that the text doesn't say that. And the crowd see Jesus and are somehow overcome with awe at the sight of him. And it has, and bear in mind, we've seen Moses. It has this sort of almost echo of Moses when he comes down from the mountain with the law that people can't look at him. He's shining bright, and it's too much to take in. I know it's interesting just that normally people being overcome with awe happens after the miracle, but Jesus arrives on the scene, and something that Mark doesn't exactly spell out for us is causing the people to be overwhelmed by Jesus' presence.
Yes. And I don't think we can move into this story without acknowledging that link to what has happened previously. I think it is significant. So whatever they are seeing, and absolutely, we have reflected before many times on the Moses-Jesus link. This would be a fairly recognizable nuance for a Jewish audience. No trouble at all. Maybe for a Gentile audience, needs a bit of educating, but certainly the sense of coming down from a mountain of encounter and still something of the resonance of that being communicated in some way or another. Absolutely. And of course, again, Mark, Matthew, and Luke follow the trajectory that you've got this sort of previously, this confession from Jesus, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then you move into this transfiguration moment about a week later. And then you have this incredible encounter, which again seems random. So you've just got Jesus coming down off the mountain, and he's confronted by a particular situation. But of course, I think what Mark and the other gospel writers are trying to do is link the situation to what has also just happened. And I think you cannot read what's about to happen in this story with this young man being liberated from this demon with what we have just witnessed on this mountain of transfiguration and the previous confession from Peter. So there is a messianic trajectory definitely being created here by Mark, and and this particular miracle is one that cements that idea very, very powerfully in the minds of his listeners and readers potentially.
And do you think there's a contrast there then, where Jesus' comments, you faithless generation, you unbelieving generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? I mean, it feels, again, I'm almost thinking about Moses, and he comes down from the mountain, and while he's been away, just chaos has ensued amongst the people of Israel, to the extent that Moses goes up the mountain to hear from the Lord who rescued them. And when he comes back down, they're all idol worshippers and they've built a golden calf. And you get this sense of Moses going like, how long was I away? And you almost feel this resonance of I want to be cautious of ascribing exasperation to Jesus in this, but that sense that I've just come back from this beautiful moment with my Father, this beautiful moment of transfiguration, and I'm now right back into the mud of it. I don't know, John, you and I have both been pastors for a long time, and so we've both experienced that phenomena of just a really good gathering of God's people, and things have gone really well, and you're really excited about it, and then you get that Monday morning email from somebody that didn't enjoy what you were doing. And it's like we've now lost cabin pressure, and we're back to earth again. I feel that from Jesus here. It's a little bit like, oh my goodness, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, do you feel that?
Oh, totally. And the language is strong, isn't it? Unbelieving generation. It's so. What are they unbelieving about? Is now again our default maybe translation of that would be, well, they're unbelieving because the context is they've tried to get this demon out of this boy and they can't. That's what the unbelieving bit is about. But is that what's going on here, or is there a wider context that actually Jesus' frustration is not just a moment with this boy, but the fact that he is contending with a generation that is grappling with ideas but missing God's person right in the midst of them? Yes. Which, of course, if you reflect on that lovely Moses motif in there, if it's there, again, it's a beautiful connection that Moses comes down from the mountain and you've got this chaos reigning. We threw in this gold and out came a calf. And you're going, what? So you've got this tension that Moses is constantly dealing with of trying to shape people, trying to get people to see the heart of God. And that seems to reflect the same tension that Jesus has, exasperated here in some way by the fact he's just come off this mountain, having met with Moses and Elijah, and this great law and the prophets meeting with Jesus, which then forms the backdrop to this dramatic miracle. So yeah,
of course, it is worth mentioning that you unbelieving generation, how much longer must I be amongst you? How much longer must I put up with you? But then notice, bring him to me. So Jesus' exasperation, if that's what it is, doesn't prevent him wanting to still help. And I think that's actually going to become important later in this particular story. And so he's exasperated. This boy has been brought to the disciples, and notice again for the second time in this week we have a situation of a person who is unable to speak. Right? So, but for a very different reason. So it seems like the first one, there was some sort of physiological challenge for the man in our earlier episode this week, and now we have this being demonic, that there's something. And not only is the boy unable to speak, but whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And now contemporary readers might read this and think, okay, wait a minute, this sounds like something that we might, it's almost epileptic. This demon is causing something which is in that sort of context. So it's an interesting little background story then. You've got this shell over the top about faith and the question about believing. And then in it you have this story around this boy who needs liberating that the disciples are unable to help with and unable to cast it out. So enter Jesus into the scene.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's lovely, if we can reflect back to our last episode, we saw there that people brought the man to Jesus. We reflected on the story of the woman from Syrian Phoenicia. She brought the request of her daughter to Jesus. And here we have this man bringing his son to Jesus. So again, you have these beautiful sort of moments where clearly, though Jesus is trying to keep a lid on the reputation and the spread of the word, it's getting out to the point where people are bringing people to him and they're saying, please help us. Now, clearly this man brought his son while Jesus was up the mountain with Peter, James and John. And hence the disciples probably, by the sounds of it, had to go, weren't able to do it, end up getting into an argument with the teachers of the law, which I think is worth coming back to when we reflect on Jesus' conclusion in this whole matter. I think there's probably a reason for that argument. But Jesus walks down the mountain into a full-flowing argument over this boy and over the fact that in some ways they haven't been able to help him. And this poor man in the middle of it, he's collateral damage. There's now a theological argument raging around him, and all he wanted was some help for his son. And again, doesn't it show you, maybe this is part of Jesus' frustration, doesn't it show you that sometimes we end up getting caught up with the wrong stuff? We end up getting into an argument over something. Actually, that's not the point. The point is actually let's try and help this boy. And then the person that was brought to us ends up losing out because we get consumed in an argument. And then you get Jesus cutting through into that and said, okay, bring him to me. Let's get this sorted out. Bring the boy to me. And so, yeah, I think you've got this lovely repeated idea of not only Jesus touching the crowds, going to people, but you get this now repeated idea of people bringing people to Jesus because the word is out and because they're desperate. And you're getting a sort of an activation almost of someone else's faith on behalf of, which seems to be a beautiful little idea that runs through the Gospels. The four friends who break through the roof to get their friend down to Jesus when he's been completely paralyzed, and the woman who speaks on behalf of her daughter, the people who bring the man, and now the father who brings his son, Jairus who speaks on behalf of his little daughter. You're getting these beautiful little bringing moments, which I think demonstrate that the ministry of Jesus is reaching, is engaging and connecting to people in the widest reams of society at this moment. It's just beautiful, I think.
And actually important to identify that when the contemporary conversations around the work of Jesus and the work of the Holy Spirit and healing happen, you do often hear a very confident conversation around faith and how people that might hope for God to work miraculously in their lives need to have faith. And it's interesting to me to note that in Mark's gospel and in the other gospels, lots of different people can have faith, and it doesn't necessarily. So be cautious, I would say, of trying to work out strategies and structures and models for healing. I see this a lot. This certain genre of Christian writing, and it's like, oh, this is how it happens. But what you see is actually there can be a whole host of people that are believing and trusting in Jesus, and so you get this. Boy, and I think it's also worth saying that although the appearance of what happens, and I read this quite a lot in scholarly works, that the appearance of what happens looks like some sort of seizure that the boy is happening, something that might appear along the lines of some sort of epilepsy or something like that. But notice Mark's not just some underinformed ancient person that goes, oh, that must be a demon, because notice that the spirit reacts to the presence of Jesus.
Yes.
So there's a lot can be said about what happens with these sort of evil spirits, unclean spirits, and demons in the New Testament. And again, it's one of these subject areas that people often speak about very confidently, and the New Testament actually leaves quite vague and quite undescribed. But it's worth noting that the evil spirits and the evil powers are never comfortable in the presence of Jesus. And so that's where, so Mark is definitely saying, whatever this looks like, there's something evil which is causing this to happen. Something very deeply dark is causing this reaction to the presence of Jesus. I mean, do you sit okay with me explaining that like that, John?
I do. I love the phrase in verse 20, and having seen him. So when they saw Jesus, I think that's unmissable. So Mark is really helping us there. And again, it's reinforcing ideas we've come across before, where demonic forces and Jesus can't inhabit the same sorts of spaces. So something's got to give. So in an attempt to get away from Jesus, perhaps we might want to see this, interpret this. They're literally trying to destroy the boy. And again, doesn't it show us this, not just an idea that we've lent into before, that Jesus and demonic forces can't be in the same space, but also the complete opposites in the two kingdoms being represented here. Here's a kingdom that Jesus represents, which is about bringing sight to blind eyes and healing to brokenness and speech to those who can't speak and freedom from those who are oppressed. This is his theme. This is his kingdom. This is the kingdom he's bringing. And the kingdom that he is now being confronted with in Mark 9 is literally, even now, it's done it all through this boy's life, it seems. But even now, in the face of potential deliverance, these demons are trying to destroy this boy's life. And, you know, whatever we say about darkness, demons, light, and the kingdom of God, one of the overwhelming hallmarks of the fruit of the kingdom of darkness is destruction. It seeks to destroy those that participate in it. It seeks to destroy those who are at the wrong end of it. It's never about building people up. And if ever people receive anything from it, it's never without strings attached. It's always about controlling, manipulating, and destroying humans. And that is the antithesis of everything God created in the Garden of Eden. God created something that would reflect his image, his glory, his majesty, and expressed ultimately in the freedom of purpose and will. And here you have a boy completely at the mercy, it seems. He's demonized. He can't even control his movements at certain points because this demon has such control of him. And however you want to think about those things in the 21st century, if the New Testament guides us in any ways, it shows us the complete divergence between these two kingdoms and the consequences of their fruit in our lives.
And Mark seems to be doing something programmatic with all of that. Like, I love that you picked up on that notion of that his intention is to destroy him. So I love that myself. But notice that, like, go back to Mark chapter 3. And in Mark chapter 3, verse 27, Jesus is being accused of a variety of things, of being a satanic worker himself. Jesus just throws this line: "No one can enter a strong person's house and plunder his property without first tying them up. Then indeed the house can be plundered." Right? And it's pretty strong language, not the sort of language you'd often associate with Jesus. But I think that Mark is showing us throughout this gospel in the miracle stories of Jesus, this is Jesus binding the strong man. This is Jesus doing exactly what he says, that I'm bringing the kingdom, but in order to bring the kingdom, I got to deal with some of the problems that are here. So this whole miracle story fits into Mark's bigger agenda of helping us understand who Jesus is. That here we have the powers of evil are trying to destroy someone, and the destruction of people is exactly what Jesus is here to stop. So he's going to do something about that. So it fits into the larger narrative of the story of Jesus in the gospel, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, totally. And of course, the irony of the end of that Mark 3, that passage, it says, Jesus was saying this because they said he had an evil spirit. He was being driven, manipulated himself by evil spirits. And of course, Jesus' ultimate wisdom in that is, well, a house divided against itself will ultimately crumble. This is crazy. Oh, and by the way, if I'm casting out demons by evil spirits, how are you doing it? So there is a challenge that he's throwing down, because it is not just something to do with his messiahship, which we'll probably reflect on here, but it's also to do with the fact he's contending with a religious community that would have exorcism as part of its world. And exorcism was not an unusual idea. Exorcism was not a unique concept to Jesus. It would have been practiced by other religious groups in the day of Jesus. But of course, there's something about this exorcism which stands out dramatically in that. But it fits broadly, of course, into the program of Jesus to destroy the kingdom of darkness, as it were, and bring people into the kingdom of light.
And with that agenda, when Jesus actually then rebukes this unclean spirit, the two part of the rebuke is quite interesting. So in the one half, Jesus says, you need to come out of him. but the other half is a never enter him again.
Never
and
return.
that seems like a little piece of definition that you don't see in necessarily some of the other exorcisms by Jesus, but this real drive again to show what Jesus is doing. It's not just that I'm going to, stop this right here, but it's stopping and we're not going back into this. He's breaking the cycles of evil and destruction, which I think is a beautiful theme.
Totally. It's the redemptive, isn't it? It's I'm not just going to come in and clean the house, but we're going to transform the house. We're going to ensure that nothing returns to this house ever again of a destructive nature. And that is the glory of redemption and salvation, that he has come to put, to use again the analogy of the house, he's come to put it under new ownership. And in binding up the strong man of that house, he can indeed clean the house and repopulate it with light and hope and truth. And that's what he clearly is doing for this young man.
Yeah. It's quite beautiful, actually, when you think about that. There, Jesus is cleaning the house and changing the locks.
Lovely, that's beautiful.
Putting this place back together.
And of course, like the inference seems to be that this boy has suffered a long time with this. So when Jesus actually asks him, how long has he been like this from childhood? Now we're not sure how old the boy was, but from childhood, which seems to imply it's been going on for a long time. And isn't it gorgeous what the Father says? But if you can't do anything, he says, take pity on us and help us. Verse 22, take pity on us and help us and have compassion. We've lent into that word. Every time Jesus has this, he does something. When he has this sort of sense of movement in his bowel, he ends up doing something. And maybe the man's connecting that idea. If you have this sort of compassion on us, then something is about to change, and something will change, and appealing to that. So you really do sense the brokenness of this man. You sense any parent who's raised a child and has had either illness issues with that child, or maybe even behavioral issues, or stuff has come into the world of your children that has kept you up every night. You will absolutely empathize with the desperation of this father, just as we heard the echo of the desperation of the mother, the Greek lady, the Syrophoenician, who appealed on behalf of her daughter. You're getting this echo of desperation crying out to the kingdom of God to come and bring relief and show pity and show help. So it's beautiful. Beautiful.
That introduces this new layer to this account, which has, I think, drawn Christians towards it that have been reading Mark's gospel for a long time, because you start to realize that Mark is writing this gospel not as just a nice account of Jesus, but he has a discipleship agenda. He wants you to think about following Jesus in all of this. So this question, if you are able, is clearly one that then captures Jesus a little bit. So you get this response from Jesus, like, if you are able, all things can be done for the one who believes. And now you start to see this second layer where we started, this question about the unbelieving generation. Now we've come back. This issue of belief has raised its head again within this story, which is interesting because you realize that Mark's again doing a lot of work in the passage, isn't he? He's telling you a miracle story, but he's also clearly wanting to get you to think about belief, about trust, about what faith is and how faith works. So that would almost be the subtext to the story, wouldn't it?
Yeah, completely. And I love this question of Jesus, if you are able. And then he says this next thing, all things are possible to the person believing. So now we I mean, it's a bit of a risk here. We often interpret that as Jesus saying to the man, okay, anything's possible to the one who believing. And of course he answers, I do believe, help my unbelief. But sometimes I've reflected on that, and I could be overcooking it, so please correct me, David. Sometimes I've reflected, because the answer relates to the question, if you are able. And it's like Jesus is saying, well, I am able. I'm able to do this. I can speak to this demon. I have in myself the authority and also the faith. So there's a sense in which the obvious interpretation of this, he's asking the man to believe. We get that, we're with that, and the man picks that up. But there's another sense in which is it Jesus saying, well, it's possible for me because I believe. It's possible for me because actually, in the face of this demon, I'm the one that the demon ultimately is going to listen to. And I'm the one that the demon ultimately will obey. So, and isn't it fascinating? At the Transfiguration, the words are slightly different from the baptism words. This is my son whom I love, identical to his baptism. But then it says at the Transfiguration, listen to him. There's something about his words, not just who he is, but what he says, that has the power to bring transformation here. And of course, Jesus is about to say some words. Jesus is about to say some things in the context of this demonized position, but he's also saying something to the man. So I hope I'm not overstretching that. I wouldn't necessarily, want to build my house on that, but I like the little nuance. If you can, well, if you're able, well, I am able, because he's standing there with both, kind of say this carefully, faith and authority in this context. So don't know if that is too much of a stretch.
Well, I think these things are always worth exploring the possible nuances of what goes on in this context. Like, I often would encourage people to remember that the language of trust and belief are the same word in the Greek. And so when you're thinking about the one who trusts, the one who believes, the one who has faith, there's a lot of nuances to what we mean. And one of the challenges, particularly if you've come from a Protestant Christian background, is you hear the word belief and you immediately start to think about belief in a set of doctrines and belief in a set of ideas. So if you go to a lot of Christians and say, oh, what do you believe? They'll point you to a section on their church website which has a list of things. So I sometimes try and change that language up to reflect the Greek. And even say, well, what do you trust? What do you trust in? Anything's possible for the one who trusts Jesus. Anyone is, and at some level, of course, Jesus is trusting the Father throughout this story.
Indeed.
Jesus is remaining loyal and having, because the language of faith and trust also is the language of fidelity, of loyalty, of commitment. There's a writer recently utilized the language of faith in terms of allegiance. Right? Of where do you connect yourself to? Where have you pitched your tent? Now that to me is really interesting. You've got this battle between the forces of evil and Jesus in this scene, and they've clashed. This demonic force is now throwing this man to the ground, and Jesus might be having a conversation about, well, what do you trust in me? Or is this the side that you want to be on? Because clearly the side that you're presently on is destroying your son. So there's an invitation to have allegiance to a different way of being and a different thinking in that. So I think all these nuances are kind of floating around in there, John, about the trust of Jesus and what he's called to do. And then, of course, the man's response, I just find... The man's response tells me that Mark is talking to us. He wants us to hear this story and hear these words as contemporary people as well. I believe, but help. Literally, there's a sense in the Greek. It's like, I believe, help my unbelieving. There's two sort of ideas contrasting together. And I would think that for a lot of people, if they really reflect on this might even be a difficult verse in verse 24, because within the sort of Christian tradition, because belief, we've put so much emphasis on believing and so much emphasis on believing the right things, even to the extent that some Christians think that some Christians have been led to believe that you're actually saved and rescued by believing, right? Forgetting that, of course, the Bible always pushes us towards it's you are believing in Jesus and it's his grace that has rescued you. It's always, the New Testament's always like it's Jesus that is the rescuer. But I find myself in some traditions sometimes, it almost sounds like that physically, no, it's me, it's my absolute believing in this that does the salvation work, which therefore means that the one thing above all things that Christians must be terrified about is doubt, is unbelieving, because that implies maybe you're not a proper Christian, maybe you're not saved, some people might even say. And I find this passage, I've talked to several people over the years about this passage, and this one causes a problem. How can you say to Jesus, I believe, and also I kind of don't believe?
Yes. And the reaction of Jesus, I find really helpful. So Jesus actually, in the midst of the story, you expect Jesus to call a time out. Well, okay, let's have a conversation about what it means to believe and what it means to not believe. And here's the amount of believing you're going to do in order to... But actually, Jesus doesn't even respond to this statement. He just then... So like it says the very next day, when Jesus saw that the crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the unclean spirit. Wow. So he doesn't even then say, okay, that's an interesting conversation. It seems to me that the reaction of Jesus shows in some way what is about to happen is less to do with the level of the believing of the Father and more to do with what Jesus wants to accomplish here. And it is a conundrum. There are moments where Jesus commends people for their faith, and we have to see that, understand that. And then there are moments where it has clearly very little to do with the believing levels of the person receiving the blessing or the healing or the miracle. And so I think within that tension, we must be careful to understand that actually it's not about necessarily faith levels and trust levels, but it's ultimately about his authority, his grace, his power, and his majesty. Now, what the interaction is within that, how that connects at different scenarios, I'm not exactly certain. I confess to our listeners, this is still a work in progress for me. But what I do see here is that Jesus hears the man, but doesn't respond to what the man says. Instead, he just acts. He gets on and does this. And so everything is possible to the one who believes. Is that directed at the man? Or is that Jesus saying, let me show you what it looks like when there's a trust level in the word of the Father, what we can actually do here? Could both things be at play here? And therefore what we're seeing is as much the trust of Jesus. And doesn't John pick it up? Jesus uses language like, whatever I see the Father doing, I do. The only thing I do is what the Father does. The only words I say. You do have a sense of Jesus. However we understand this in the context of the mystery and glory of the Trinity, you have Jesus aligning himself with the agenda of the Father, even though he is God himself and a distinct person within that Godhead, yet he submits to whatever the Father wants at a particular moment. And remember, he's just come down the mountain. He's just met with the Father, and he's coming out of that perhaps with a sense of, let me show you what trust looks like. It's actually not down to your trust. It's down to me. So I mean, I don't know. I'm thinking a bit out loud. I know that might sound a bit raggedy to our listeners, but one of the things we've tried to do in this podcast is be really honest about stuff we think we've got a measure of confidence on and clarity. And also we've tried to be honest about, I'm not quite sure what that really means, but we catch the heart of it as we try to understand it. I think what we mustn't do is make a formula out of it. I think that's the danger, because once you start going, right, faith is the key for everybody, then we're into, well, how much faith and what does that look like? And explain the moments when I had faith and nothing happened, and explain the moments when I didn't really believe and something did happen, because that's part of all of our journey, isn't it?
Yes, totally. I can't help but think of Paul's language in Philippians 3 and verse 12, where, sort of literal reading of it, Paul is talking about what he experiences in Jesus, and he's talking about the righteousness that Christ has brought to him, but then he just says this. But I've not already achieved this. And then a lot of English translations tidy this up because it is a messy, hard to understand piece of Greek. But he basically seems to say, I've not yet reached perfection, but I press on, hoping to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus already took hold of me. So I, like, this is how I find myself looking at this text anyway, John, is that Paul is saying, listen, I'm trying to keep doing this, and I'm trying to get there and believe this and trust this properly. But all of my trust and all of my belief is always a response to what Jesus has done first. I think it's the Pauline scholar J.L. Martin says that God doesn't respond to us. He always moves first. So we think God is responding to us, but he has already reached out to us and grabbed us and answered us beforehand. So I sometimes imagine it like that Jesus has got me. That is without a doubt. Let me just talk about it personally in that sense. So Paul seems to be saying that Jesus has got me, and that is unequivocal. That's just definite. And therefore, given that he's got me, I'm safe. The question is now I want to try and grasp onto him with the same level that he is grasping on to me. And I kind of hear that in this Mark story here as well. I see Jesus, I believe, but help my unbelief. Well, of course that's okay, because Jesus has got this man. Jesus has got this boy. And what we tend to do within the modern Protestant context anyway is assume that if I start to feel a little shaky in my faith in Jesus, then everything gets a little shaky. But Paul definitely, and you see it through the Gospels as well, because no, that's not how it works. You might get shaky. You might even get a little faithless. But God cannot deny himself. He will continue to hold on to that. So that's one aspect that I think might be going on here that might relate to what you're saying.
Oh, for sure. So that's so beautiful. Beautiful link, David. Really gorgeous. And it seems to help. The dad has enough trust to bring Jesus, to bring the boy to Jesus. So maybe that's, but then maybe expressing, but I haven't got a clue how this is going to get fixed, because we've never seen anybody like this get fixed, which again leans into this sort of messianic sign. There's something in the way this boy is demonized, which means this is a more difficult place, a more difficult context for the local exorcism experts, because it's a spirit that has robbed him of speech. So I think the dad is going, I look, my faith has got me here, but I've no clue what to do next. I don't know. And then that leans exactly into this conversation. Well, that's okay. God's got it. I love it. My youngest daughter was chatting with someone once on a plane and offered to pray for them, and the person said, as my daughter offered to pray for them, well, I don't really believe in God. And she said, that's okay. I do. So it's like, you know, as she told me that story, as we picked up our cases, getting off the plane, I thought that is so cool. Actually, that person on the plane didn't need to believe. Actually, well, I believe in God. And is that the dynamic happening here with the man, the Father, and Jesus? He goes, I do believe, but help me. And yet Jesus has already expressed to him, it's okay. I've got this. I can take care of this. You may be struggling to believe how this is going to work out, but I got this. I think there's much more in the... I think humans like nice straight lines on issues of belief and faith and what triggered what and what made what and what resulted in what. And we're always looking for formula and straight lines and answers and the ability to make sure we've got everything where it's... And I think the gospel story shows sometimes moments of mess and sponginess, but it's actually showing us that he's still able, even if we're not quite sure what faith and trust looks like in this context.
And that's so important, because what the negative side of it is, if you think that absolute certainty is what is required to be a follower of Jesus, then invariably what happens is, if you don't feel absolute certainty, your feeling is, should I just walk away from following Jesus?
True.
And John, this is a theme. Like, if I could even just whistle stop tour for a moment, right? But what we see here, and what you're just saying, that's okay if you don't believe, because I do. Thomas, right? Let's go to Thomas as a classic example. Well, I'm not sure I'm going to believe in Jesus unless I see his hands and his side. And Jesus turns up and said, that's okay, Thomas. Here's my hands, here's my side. Right? The fact that you believe it or don't believe it, I'm still here. So Thomas's belief or lack of belief doesn't change the reality. In Matthew, now think about this. I wonder how many of our listeners have ever noticed this. The Great Commission, the end of Matthew's Gospel. It says in verse 17 of Matthew 28, they're all heading up and they go to see Jesus for the last time. It says, when they saw him, they worshipped him. And some English translations do this strange thing where they then say, but some were doubtful. But looking at the Greek, it's really interesting, because the Greek to me seems to read, and seeing him they worshipped and they doubted.
Yes.
So, but regardless of how you read this is the resurrected Jesus, and the worship also contains doubt. Right? So they didn't worship and were absolutely certain that he was the Messiah and was raised from the dead. And even then, they were doubtful. And then, to end my whistle-stop tour, John, favorite passage for you and me. It's so cruel of me to bring it up as a throwaway comment, but the road to Emmaus. The road to Emmaus. Like, I love the fact, and I hope that we hear this. Jesus meets these two disciples. They are walking away from Jerusalem. They are giving up. They say to Jesus, we had hoped that he was going to be the one. Like, we had hoped. Not we are hoping, we had hoped. We've given up on that belief. And Jesus, I love this, John. I got to be careful I don't turn into a preacher for a second. But I love this, that Jesus, the Son of God, hears somebody say to them, yeah, we thought it was Jesus, but we don't think it's Jesus. And Jesus says, well, let's walk and talk about that. Right?
Come on.
And then they continue walking in the wrong direction. So they continue away towards their giving up as Jesus talks to them about himself. And then, of course, the beautiful line is, once they figure it out, they turn around and run back. But Jesus, the Son of God, lives with them in their doubt. And so when you tie all these stories, they're worshiping and doubting, Thomas is doubting, you get why this father going, well, I believe, but help my unbelief. Jesus is okay with that. Yep. Jesus is absolutely okay with that. So, like, please, I would say, I have turned into a preacher now, but I can't escape me being a pastor. Just good. Please don't give up on Jesus because you're uncertain. That would be one of the big takeaways from this passage.
Come on, for sure. Absolutely. And we tend to read back into those Gospels and think these guys had it all together and it was all dead easy. And the Gospel writers are working very hard to show us, no, dots are still not connecting. They're still not getting it. They're asking the wrong questions. They're moving in the wrong direction. You and I we must do a series sometime on Luke 24, me and you together. But like a 7-mile walk in the wrong direction. I mean, that's how committed Jesus is to us in our uncertainty. And if ever there was a text that shows he's not only interested in us when we're certain, actually he's profoundly interested in us when we're not certain. And he's prepared to walk 7 miles in the wrong direction with us to turn that idea around. That is mind-blowing to me. It's magnificent. And doesn't it again, it takes... You have to be careful here that we're not being heard to say what we're not saying, but it takes the pressure off me. It takes the pressure off us. Yeah. Yes, I have a responsibility to believe and follow, of course. But even in the moments when I'm faithless, he is faithful. And I love that. Yeah. And I for sure, I am only here because he has remained relentlessly faithful, bounding in loving kindness and faithfulness. The confession says, "Oh my goodness, it's gorgeous, David." And I think that's here. I think there's beautiful compassion within this, Jesus acknowledges the man's struggle and then just moves on. Doesn't make a point of it, doesn't embarrass him, doesn't stop to have a sermon. Right, we need to get that squared up before we can sort this boy out. No, just goes, well, okay, I get it. Let me sort it out now. I'll go and fix this. And I love that. I love that.
There's a beautiful quote from Michael Gerson, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, USA newspaper. And I have this written down in several places because I just love the words of it. This is what Gerson says. He says, faith, thankfully, does not preclude doubt. Yeah. It consists instead of staking your life on the rumor of grace. And then he continues. I mean, that's so good, isn't it?
Repeat that line. Staking your life on the rumor of grace.
Faith, thankfully, does not preclude doubt. It consists instead of staking your life on the rumor of grace.
That's beautiful.
And then he says this. He says, there is this difference for a Christian believer. At the end of all of our striving and longing, we find not a force, but a face.
Beautiful.
All language about God is metaphorical, but the metaphor became flesh and dwelt amongst us.
Wow. Oh, that's too good. Sometimes you hear a piece of writing and you think, why didn't I write that? That's too good. Oh, that is gorgeous. Oh.
And why I love that passage here, because this father has staked his life on the rumor of grace. I've heard about this Jesus, and so I'm bringing my son here. It's all I've got. It's all I've got, and therefore, if you can do something, then please help us. It's just beautiful. It is
beautiful. It is beautiful. And we get this sort of to try and track back, I think, from where we started from. We lent into this idea that Jesus comes down out of the mountain. There seems to be a messianic trajectory here. So at one level, we've got a human story: dad, son, brokenness, faith, struggle, belief, all going on. But then, of course, there is a macro journey, isn't there? There's a messianic something or other going on here. And I tell you what caught my attention, David, like never before, my reflections just on this one, was when the disciples, Jesus exorcises the demon and sets the boy free. It's just incredible, and looks like he's dead, but he's not, and it's all wonderful. And then they go indoors. I love that. They go indoors and have this chat. And the disciples go, why couldn't we deliver the boy? And what struck me like never before on my reflections, you know how things spring out at you? And I went, hold on. Jesus says, this kind can only come out by prayer. Now, here's where my eyes have always gone on that, David. I've always gone to prayer and fasting, because some translations have this kind comes out. So so that's come back to our conversation. Here's where I've always gone with this. I've always gone, okay, what do I need to do to get that demon out? Okay, I need to pray more and I need to fast more, right? And I have, up until reflecting on this story this very week for this recording, I have never thought about this kind, right? And I think maybe it's our conversation, so I've got my brain buzzing on that, and it's all in the background of my head, and I'm going, this kind, messianic trajectory, what does that mean? And the sort of idea that the exorcists of the day, and this is well-worn documentation, the exorcists of the day would often seek to know the name of the demon in order to speak to that demon and with a higher name, adjure that demon to leave. The problem, of course, we have here is that this demon is robbing the boy of speech. So what do you do when you've got a demon that the human host can't speak? You can't use the normal practices. And I think that's what the disciples and the teachers of the law are arguing about. I think they're arguing about the best way to get this demon out of this boy, because the normal processes aren't working. And if the demon has robbed the human of speech, then we've got a problem. In steps Jesus. And even though we've seen Jesus use these techniques in Mark 5 where he speaks and the demon speaks back to him, what is your name? We are legion, for we are many. This idea. Here, the demon can't speak, or at least won't speak, and Jesus still gets this demon out. And I think that's what leans into this messianic idea, that the Messiah is the one who has the authority to even speak into a situation that won't reply, won't speak back, and bring authority to this particular moment. Does that make sense in terms of this kind? This kind, that's what grabbed me here.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. I've not drawn that connection between the discussion at the front and the discussion at the end, that there's some sort of analysis going on here in that terms of what's... Yeah, but I had noticed that Jesus' engagement with this demon is different because it can't speak. So it is interesting as to how you then read this as a... So let me ask you, Liz, are you saying then that Jesus is not providing a sort of general rule of thumb here? He's saying, actually, we've got a demon here who can't talk, so therefore prayer is the only thing we can do. Is that kind of what you're sort of resonating with?
Well, partly in that, but also the fact that there's an authority coming to this situation that doesn't require the normal conversation to have this demon exercise. Okay, who are you? Okay, here's who I am. Here's who I'm coming in. Therefore, you have to go. But actually, Jesus is able to bypass that, and by exercising the person without the demon speaking, he demonstrates this sort of authority. It's the same sort of thing we've seen in Matthew 12, where the reaction of the crowd when they see the man again who's robbed of speech, who gets delivered. It says, and all the multitudes were amazed and said, "Can this be the Son of David?" Now, why that reaction when they've seen other people set free from demons? Could it be the reaction is because there's an authority here being expressed, which is nothing to do with names or conversation. It is to do with who is standing before them and the authority that he has, and therefore, in a sense, where Jesus is giving instructions to the disciples that actually this is not about. Can I say this carefully? It's not even their faith in the situation. It is about his name in the situation that is the ultimate authority to get this demon out that Jesus commands and speaks. I'm not sure if I'm being clear there, but I think there's if we're following the sort of messianic link, there seems to be something linking the fact that Jesus can do this without this conversation. And that's the stuff that hasn't been seen so much, if at all, in the world of Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, it's complex, and I appreciate you trying to navigate it and help us see what's going on there. Jesus is reframing exorcism then slightly. He's saying, well, actually, we're not going to do this as a kind of negotiation with with this demon. We actually are going to live in the authority that comes by... I mean, I'm filling in some blanks here, but given the format of the story so far, it's almost as if Jesus is saying we don't need to do the talking back and forward. Number one, we can't. Number two, we don't actually need to, because once we put our trust in Jesus or realize that Jesus is the one who can sort this out, which is what prayer is doing. Prayer is putting your faith. When you go to God and say, hey, please help me with this, that's a faith move. And I think sometimes we forget that about prayer, don't we? Think about it. You are sat in your room by yourself, talking to yourself, right? Now, if you don't believe in God, that's what's happening when a person's praying. If you go into a prayer meeting and don't believe in God, it's a lot of people talking to themselves in an empty room. How do we know that's not the case? Well, here's the thing, we don't. That's where faith comes in. When you pray, even if it's a simple prayer over your food or whatever it is, you are acting in faith to believe that someone's listening, that someone's hearing, that someone can do something about this. So there's a sense, now tie that into the story, that's exactly what we've seen happen in this story, isn't it? And I think you're right to point out, and I know you just made it as a quick reference, that certain older translations of the Bible often put prayer and fasting at this point, but the sort of early manuscripts don't have that word fasting in there. So if you dig up some of the early, somewhere along the line in church tradition, this word has got inserted into some of the later manuscripts, and then I think the King James Bible kept it in its translation, and that was how we got it in here. Yes. Now, one of the reasons it's a later edition is not only do all the earlier versions not have it, but the other significant thing is, of course, there isn't any fasting in this story. So it would be strange for Jesus to say, this comes out through prayer and fasting, because there hasn't been any. There hasn't been any fasting. But the thing that interests me is, there's almost a level of then saying, so agreeing with what you're absolutely saying, that this is coming through the trust and the authority of Jesus. The question is, where is the prayer in the story? And I love the fact that the only prayer I can see is, I believe, help my unbelief. So now think about that this conversation from the Father that looks to us like a complete failure. If you've been brought up within certain Christian traditions, it's exactly not the thing you should say to Jesus. Might that honesty and that transparency and that surrender of control actually be the prayer of faith? Jesus, I actually don't know if I have enough belief for this. But because he's found his way to the one with the authority, then that prayer has activated the whole sort of story. I don't know if that adds to what you're saying, John, but I kind of love that resonance.
It's lovely. And it's all in the mix, isn't it? There's a beautiful mix of human desperation in the middle of this, and can I say this without sounding perverse, the purity of that human desperation, which touches the heart of Jesus. And there's this sideline of argument that's going on, because there's a perplexity as to why they haven't been able to exorcise this boy, perhaps, and they're arguing among themselves, and Jesus has to bypass the argument, get to the purity of this expression, the brokenness of this man, and then bring something of the kingdom of God to that world. So I think there's so many things in the mix here. And again, if you're looking for formula, this is difficult. But if you're trying to capture the heart of humility and honesty and hunger that attracts the face of God, then this story really ticks a number of those beautiful big boxes and invites God and his authority into the situation that can change everything. And it's absolutely beautiful. That beautiful indeed.
And just one more thing then, that as we land this phenomenal little passage that I just want to throw in is that so the exorcism happens, right? And everybody is there. They see it happening. He convulses, cries out, and the demon comes out. And then it says this: the boy was like a corpse, right? Yeah. In fact, most of them said he's dead. It's obviously an intense scene that's just happened. He looks like a dead body. Everybody around there says he is a dead body. Something very bad has happened. And then it says, verse 27, Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he was able to stand, right? But what's interesting there is the three words: grasped him by the hand, lifted him up, and he stood. Those are the same three words that happen about Jairus' daughter, who was dead. Okay, so it's interesting that even Mark's language gives away that at some level. But then what's really interesting is that the word that when it says lifted him up, this word lifted him up is actually the Greek word gyro, which is the same word that's used when the young man in chapter 16 says Jesus is not here. He has been raised. He has been gyroed, right? Beautiful. So there's definitely, Mark doesn't explicitly say the boy actually died and this is a resurrection, But you can't help but think that Mark's readers, reading this in Greek, they're drawing a connection. It's the same three words, grasped, raised, and stood. Same three words as with Jairus' daughter. But then that throw forward to the fact that Jesus is going to be raised. You now see this little nuance in the story, leading us into resurrection, leading us into the hope of Jesus, and what Jesus is doing for this boy is ultimately what's going to do for himself and everybody, which I think is a beautiful little nuance that I don't want to miss.
Oh, so good, so good. And I think it's a great place to conclude in terms of the last two episodes that we've looked at, that Jesus brings life into death. He brings peace into the chaos. He brings hope into the darkness. And in this context, to use that beautiful motif, brings that resurrection life into what was certainly destruction and death of this young man. And ultimately, that's what he came to do in terms of his messiahship. And that's what he calls his followers to be part of, to challenge a kingdom that would seek to destroy, cripple, ruin, decimate lives, and to establish a kingdom that is about bringing life and freedom, to use these few beautiful expressions, to take people by the hand, to lift them up and to help them stand. And that is the gospel, isn't it? And the gospel that Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim. And we see that over and over and over again. So beautiful, beautiful stuff. Lord, I believe. Help me in my unbelief.
Okay, that's it for today. And as we said at the start of this episode, we're going to take a small break for the rest of August and release our second half of the Miracle season at the beginning of September. We hope that you enjoy the break and are ready to join with us again when we return in September. But for now, please feel free to get in touch with either of us about something we said. You know, you can reach out to us at podcast@twotext.com or by liking and following the Two Text Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left a review on your podcast app or one of our social media sites. And if you really enjoyed this episode, then why don't you share it with a friend? Don't forget, you can listen to all our previous episodes at twotexts.com or wherever you get your podcasts. But that is it for now. We'll be back in early September. But until then, goodbye.